going on, cultivators of the future? You are currently tuned in to Astor Education. I am your host and facilitator, Robert Astwood. And today we actually have something different on the show schedule. So we're going to have what I like to call a little inquiry session, basically like an interview. So I have with me today Professor Friedrich, associate professor at Teachers College, Columbia University. And his major interests happen to be democratic education and curriculum, both inside and outside of schooling. All right, so to start, obviously, introduce yourself, Danny.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. What is your main, I'm going to start off big and juicy. I'm going in all in big splash. Sorry. What is your main life mission? Like, what would you say is your main purpose as an educator? Maybe clarify like that.
I think as an educator, I want people to get out of my classes, out of reading my stuff, looking at the world with different eyes. I want people to start questioning some of the assumptions, to sort of stop for a little bit and think about their own practice and how they're engaging with the world, and what do we need to do in order to make the world better.
Okay. I want to follow up questions, but I know you have limited time. So, so in terms of this making the world better, what would that look like?
Well, we live in a world where a vast portion of the population, both in the US and abroad, live in unlivable conditions. These unlivable conditions are material unlivable conditions, they are ethical unlivable conditions, they're unlivable conditions based on their identities, they can be unlivable conditions based on their beliefs. And I want a world that is more fair, more equal. I want a world in which people can live their lives to their fullest potential, but also I want a world of solidarity and of collective action towards addressing historical inequities and historical wrongs.
Okay. So what do you think that, other than like because solidarity is definitely a big one, and I love everything that you're saying. What do you think would be, I guess, in terms, along with that, a main interest of you, like of yours, in terms of schooling, like not education, let's say official schooling?
Right. When we study about schooling from a critical perspective, we develop a lot of tools to critique what schools are doing. And I'm done with that. I think schools are failing a lot of students. Schools are failing a lot of communities. But I'm also a staunch defender of public education as a common good, as a space for democracy. I do think that public school has the potential to be a site for different kind of politics, a site for community building, a site for things that cannot happen in other spaces. So even though a lot of schools are failing a lot of people, I still believe in the promises of public education as a site for democracy. So I want my work to serve that, to allow people to see and do school differently, public school differently, in order to make it more aligned with democratic goals.
So, I'm reading Dewey right now. I forget there's so many Deweys. Like, he's loved talking about democracy and education. I think it was an essay that he wrote where he talks about this idea of fellowship. And I don't know, like, if you're familiar with this concept, but basically what it is like fellowship in terms of not only bringing about a world where, things like solidarity or equality and equity are like prevalent, and not only where we're like a world where hatred and these things like crimes, like they're not like permeating. It's not only that, like, but it's like making it so that way, like the potential for them to even happen is lower, just because people aren't thinking like that, So that's one of my questions too, is like, when you think of public education, like how it's set up in the this kind of neoliberalistic society, what do you think would be a way, like what are some values that would orient it away from this neoliberal, like kind of production capitalistic base, and center it toward altruism? Like, how do we center it toward things like altruism, eco-pedagogy, like just these things that kind of support interdependence of people working together as opposed to looking at people as just standing reserves.
Right. So one of the things that I think for me is clear is there's no silver bullets, right? There's no one thing, one set of recipes that if we follow this, we'll succeed. Nothing like that. I think we need to put our heads together and we need to find solutions for different settings. But some general principles can guide our thinking. For instance, the reason I talk about public education and not just schooling, and I don't believe this can happen necessarily in private schools, is because I think in public schooling, you have the idea that the school is a public good. It doesn't belong to anyone. And the people that inhabit it are not customers. They're not clients. They're not paying. They're all welcome to be there as citizens and as people that live in that community, right? And so everyone has a stake in public school because it's not a good that belongs to someone, but it's the same way as a public library. Is something linked to the common good. And so when we find good public schools, the reason they're good is not necessarily because they're teaching a particular kind of academic skill, but it's good because everyone feels invested in it. So everyone comes together to figure out what are the problems for a community and how can we address those problems in the community through this pedagogical project. And that is in many ways counter to capitalism, right? So if capitalism is about the maximization of wealth, it's about the maximization of the individual's profit. And I think public school, again, as a promise, not necessarily as a concrete project in specific schools. It happens in some schools, but not in the majority. I would like that to see more of that. But public schools have the promise to not be about maximizing individuals' benefit, but coming together as a project to educate our young, right? And so I think that good schools are schools that understand their role in that community and not as a colonial project of trying to impose knowledge on young minds, but as a site in which the knowledge of the community and the interests and the problems of the community are addressed together.
How do you, I like that idea of like public education, because that's really what I'm thinking of too. Like when I think of K through 12, I'm thinking of, we have to reform the public education system so that way it really like kind of creates this space for what you're talking about to occur. So like how do
why only K through 12?
Say it again.
Why only K through 12? I mean, well, you could have, I mean, there are countries in which education is free and it's a right for everyone, no matter what level it is, from birth through postdocs. And it's not about wealth, right? Sort of Argentina, which is the country I come from, higher education is a public good, and therefore public universities are free any level, and they have no requirements except for you only have to finish high school in order to, you have no entrance examination, you just go to school. And so it's a different understanding of education, not as a privilege, but as a right. So it doesn't have to be only K through 12.
Mm-hmm. And I definitely agree with that too. Like the reason I always think of K through 12 first is because that's the youth. So it's like the youth they're the door to the future. It's like, so if we're corrupting them, we're going to inevitably perpetuate this cycle of corruption. And even Rousseau, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau talks about it in his Emile, right? Like he talks about how he takes it a little too far. I think like, completely sheltering the child away is a little bit too much, but he has an idea when he says like he's onto something in terms of like the society. Like I think society does deprave, our youth in terms of like even just thinking about what money is or thinking about what it means to be happy or what is like just different concepts, So that's the only reason I brought up K through 12. But yeah, absolutely. I do think that schooling should be accessible to everybody, like all throughout all the like ages. But I'm thinking, because you brought up, what country was that again that you mentioned? Argentina. See, I'm not too familiar with the demographics. How would you describe the demographics? Is it very like mixed? Like how is the demographics there?
Well, Argentina it's much poorer country than the US. That's why I mean it's like having a free university and up to doctoral degrees and all that, doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a wealthy country. It has to mean that that's your priority, right? Sort of,
Yes.
it's not about wealth. In terms of racial categories, there are different racial histories throughout the world. So you cannot apply the same demographic categories in the US that you apply in Argentina. In Argentina, you have many more people that have mixed heritage of like indigenous populations and Spanish populations, and so it's a mix. But I don't know that I don't want to talk about demographics in the same term that we talk about the US, because the racial categories are different, the histories are different.
And that actually is why I brought it up too, because like I know I've always heard like certain things about like countries like Finland, I think even Singapore, like certain of these foreign countries that they say, oh, education is doing well there or whatnot, and I feel like it's like a lot of the demographic or like a lot of the nation, like what makes up the country is different, and like they can prioritize on different things. So I feel like I'm speculating right now. Like, do you think because of our multicultural background and like makeup that it makes it harder for us to harmonize our approach?
No, I don't think it's. I don't think you need to harmonize much. I think the U.S. has a history of deep attachments to the myth of meritocracy, deep attachments to individualism, and so it's much more about that than whether it's multicultural or not. There are no countries that are purely homogeneous. We can have those myths around, but different countries have different populations, and that in itself is not a problem to be solved, right? I think multiculturalism or people like having different demographics is not a problem in itself. Like, what I'm saying is that it's about the history of the countries, and I think the US has such a resistance in general to understanding. So, for example, the fact that in the US Constitution there is no right to an education, that is inscribed in some states' constitutions, but not all of them, right? It's because the US has a really hard time getting outside the individual's right to freedom above all. And sometimes when you say, like, we should have a right to healthcare, that means universal healthcare, not affordable, but universal healthcare. It has to override the idea that, well, then I don't have the freedom to choose how much I pay for it or whatever. Yeah, no, you shouldn't have that freedom, for me, in my opinion. Right? So it's a history of US ways of thinking that is more the obstacle than whether you have this or that population in the country.
And it's so funny that you said that, because I literally had a question that says, hey, America tends to place heavy value on individuals, when I was saying, like, ironically, a democratic society is hard to achieve if you're just focusing on individuals, like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like, so it's kind of like, it doesn't make sense. It's like an oxymoron, right? So it's like, it doesn't really add up. So in terms of philosophy, like, what do you think philosophy's purposes in education? Before you answer that, all right, I'm skipping ahead. Let me ask you this first. What's the difference between, like, what do you think is the difference between official schooling and education?
Schooling is one way of educating, one among many, right? Schooling has a particular history. Schooling, as we know it, comes from Central Europe as a project deeply tied to the Industrial Revolution. It's one way of organizing knowledge, knowers, curriculum, classrooms, age. All of that has a history. It's not natural to humans, right? So the fact that it has a history means it can change too. Now, when I think of education or curriculum, I don't only think of schooling. Schooling is an important site to think about. And like I said before, it's an important political project. But we also learn through reading comics and listening to music and watching movies, navigating the streets of a city, talking to one another. So curriculum means the question of knowledge and circulation of knowledge, what knowledge matters, what knowledge doesn't matter, what knowledge is prioritized, what knowledge is centered, marginalized, whose knowledge counts. All of those questions, which are the questions at the core of curriculum studies, can be asked both inside of schools and outside of schools. I do a lot of work with pop culture, and I'm really interested in how is it that we're forming ourselves and learning to be humans through pop culture, for example. So schooling is really important, but it's only one site in which education takes place.
I completely and totally agree. I think that official schooling is, again, like, it's just that one way. And I feel like not only is it one way, but the way that official schooling is implemented, it's kind of purported as the only way to be, like, to exist in the world. And so I'm really glad that you are, like, acknowledging that, like, hey, like, there are other ways. Not only are there other ways, but we should actually seek them out too. I'm adding that on. Like, I think we should seek out those other ways, because they're going to add on to us as individuals. And like the world is a teacher. The world is, like, doesn't need to be, like, necessarily a body. Like, one thing I say about teaching is that it's the exposure, it's insight exposure, insight revelation, right? It reveals you to something in the world. And that doesn't always have to be a physical person, right? Like, that could be the world if you're tuned in, right? Like, if there's a certain situation that you're tuned into, like, you probably might get something more out of it, as opposed to, not be like doing that. So, okay. So yeah, I think education happens all the time. It's ongoing. So yeah, let me ask now, what do you think the significance of philosophy is in education, not official schooling, in education?
What do you mean by philosophy when you ask that question?
Ah, man. All right. Philosophy. When I think about philosophy, I think about a process. Education and philosophy are kind of the same. Like, not the same, but like similar. Like, just like how education improves somebody, or it can improve yourself or customize you, I think philosophy helps you to become more nearly human. Like, it helps you to discover, like, yourself, how to interact with others. It helps you to sharpen your understanding. So I would say the purpose of, like, philosophy is, like, the process of, like, learning via your experience, like, gaining, like, adding new things onto yourself, like, kind of gain new understandings, developing new understandings, I would say, like, in a nutshell.
So in what you're describing, education and philosophy are not different, right? They're the same. So like, that's why for me it's really hard to answer your question, what is the relation between education and philosophy? Because it just depends on what you define as philosophy, right? If philosophy is just one field in which mostly white European men talk about the world, then we need to question that, right? But if you expand the notion of philosophy to think of philosophy as thinking, then philosophy as thinking is also philosophy as education. So in that sense, we're all the time dealing with philosophy, whether we're aware of that or not. It's the same thing with, like, a lot of people in education talk about the theory-practice gap. And I'm not sure there's a gap. I think that when we are theorizing is a practice, practicing is always led by a lot of theories we have in our head, whether we are aware of them or not. We're just guided by our thinking. So we have to look at those things anew to understand how they are deeply implicated. Same with philosophy, right? Philosophies are ways of seeing the world, and they're always present in ourselves, in our practice.
Okay. All right. So let me start wrapping this up. I have two more questions for you. You kind of been, like, hinting at them, but let me ask them, like, pointedly, directly, especially for, like, the viewers and listeners. So with your views, your values, experiences, what do you want to see as the future of education? What does it look like? How does it sound? How are the teachers? How are the learners? What capacities can they do? Paint the picture for us.
I think one of the things is that education outside of schools, and it's already happening. The question is whether we're ready to see it as happening. So I think there's a lot of things that are taking place already that are the future, but we need to change our frameworks to see them, right? So the ways in which kids are learning through TikTok, the ways in which kids are expressing themselves in their own YouTube channels and all that, that's already part of this idea that everyone has the chance to explore their own ways of being in the world. And the question is, how do we get schools to pay more attention to that without ruining it, right? But with that, this sounds idyllic, and it's not idyllic, because those flows of information are always asymmetrical, they're always unequal. And so I think when you ask me of the future, what I want to see, again, is the historical troubles that have minoritized populations, that have seen people oppressed, actually addressed. Like, we talk a lot about reparations. I'm a full proponent of reparations. What would educational reparations look like? I think that's a key question to think about schooling for the future, right? How do we address the injustices of the past in current schooling practices? And that is, again, a community project. It's not a project that I can here design and tell all the schools what to do. It's never going to come top down. Top down, what can come down are the resources to conduct those. Mm-hmm. But the actual practices have to happen at the community level.
Okay. I have follow-up, but we're running out of time. So my last final question, what is one action that you can take today, right now, to make that future a reality?
So I hope I am taking some of those actions, right? I mean, I hope that my teaching, if I think of impact, I'm thinking of my teaching. I'm thinking of the ways in which people in my courses are, again, like I said at the beginning, right? Seeing the world with new eyes that not only make those injustices visible, but also the potential to address those injustices more real in their lives. Personally, by sending my own kids to my own neighborhood's public school, which happens to be a Title I school, I think it's a matter of saying I have a stake as much as anyone living in my community in that school, and that's important. I don't choose to send my kids to quote unquote the best school I can afford, because I don't think my kids deserve a better education than anyone else just because I have the means, right? So I think that, again, trying to get involved in public schooling as a parent, for me personally, is one of the ways in which I try to address those things. And writing, I mean, I love writing, and so writing has to do with that too, sort of expressing myself and putting my ideas out there for everyone to access and to have a conversation, to continue the conversation.